God told me a story about Vishnu, and I don't know if this is in the Hindu text or in the Jewish text, but it goes like this: that in the beginning there was a stone, and that stone was Vishnu. It had always been there, and even though it was a non-life form, it was dead. After eons and eons and eons, before time existed, it became conscious. It evolved. It became a being, and it ultimately created the first reality, which isn't a bad copy that we live into today. And this being created a garden, and after eons and eons and eons, he heard the wind. And as he heard the wind, he had the first thought about love. Now, God tells me that that is ultimately him. And it was, in fact, a metaphor. It wasn't actually anything other than the wind to begin with. But the thought was love. So from that, he told me that, and I haven't read this in physics, and I don't know I've ever read it, but that he ultimately, in our language, other than that, is the force between atoms, the strong and weak force between atoms. And that through the Gnostic Nag Hammadi library, which Jesus say isn't the truth, the whole truth, he is the way, the truth, and the life. So we can't read into everything because they got things wrong, Jesus said. But he's referencing the Essenes. So we know from books, from Skywatch TV and others, that these Essenes knew more or less everything to do with reality and even predicted Jesus. So they say that, and the Jews obviously, that God created all the angels, of which we know Lucifer was one. We call him Lucifer, it's not actually his name, but we call him Lucifer, cherubim. And he, bearing in mind that Lucifer just simply means Venus, that the morning star. And in today's world, we all know about Baphomet. You can even see, obviously, in King Charles's, for those who don't know, King Charles's new painting, which is of himself with a red background. If you go to other alternative media sites like Infowars, you can see with Alex Jones that that is, in fact, Baphomet. If you look at mirror images, and just apparently it's actually a computer program, and someone's painted it, and you can see satanic images in it. Very consciously put in, that is. So the scholars say Baphomet is Hermes, being horned god, and Venus together, because they were in fact lovers in union with each other. And as far as man is concerned, that is a combination of the satanic energy of today. According to Jonathan Cahn, he speaks of Venus. And to cut a long story short, I've talked about this before, but Venus was basically a prostitute god, warrior goddess, and her job, according to Jonathan Cahn, was to bring down the marriage between a man and a woman. And obviously Hermes, being a fallen angel, a fertility sex god, where we get the term pansexual, is and they merge them together, is a dark entity of the past, of which all occult science is talking about, is writing about, is literally writing songs and poems and books about, and movies. And the Christians think this is the most satanic thing you've ever seen. But all the stories put together, like I've put together, I've simply pieced together this jigsaw from what the occult has been saying in films and TVs and songs, and I've read around it. So the the creation story in the Garden of Eden is therefore Kronos' way, who he thought he was God in the Nag Hammadi Gnosticism library, according to the Gnostics. He thought he's so old that he thought he was God, and Vishnu ultimately created him. And Vishnu separated what he had, what was there, was, and then he into three parts, and ultimately he created the earth and all the diversity within it, including humans. And one of the biggest pieces of evidence for Christians to indicate that is that it was always a trick in the Garden of Eden for Adam and Eve to never eat of that which they should not eat, the tree of good and evil, and ultimately that forbidden sexual encounter, and to be like the Most High. So it's, for those who read about Christianity and then secularists, they're put off straight away, because why would God do that? Just an obvious trick there. And obviously, for Christians, God, when we read God in English, we just assume, like, there are many different types of scholars within Christianity, but many just assume that God just means the Father, Jehovah. And there are a lot of people that understand that there are different types of names for God, like Abba, El Shaddai, and Elohim. But the Jews hid his name, knowing his name, hid his name, and created the tetragram, of which we get in English Jehovah. And they mainly say, obviously different types of Jews, but they say Hashem just means the name. And they don't even say or write God. They don't dare to really speak his name. But in the Bible, we have I am that I am. And if you read further, even on simple websites like Wikipedia, you'll see that there is another way of saying I am that I am, which is I am who I will be. Which is ultimately where I believe the writers of Doctor Who have put in Doctor Who. And throughout Doctor Who, it becomes obvious with his reincarnations and the references to the Lion King and myriad other sources, and Pandorica opens, and places like Arcadia mentioned within Doctor Who in the film with Matt Smith, and the Atlanteans being similar to the Time Lords, and then Time Lord itself being exactly the same, more or less, as Kal. Kalki, Kalki is the last Messiah of the Hindus, who is ultimately exactly like the rider on the white horse with a flaming sword in Revelation. Well, we've seen a flaming sword before in the Bible, and that's the sword that was used to stop Adam and Eve going back into the garden after the fall. And much of this, if not all of this, is spoken of in Good Omens with David Tennant and Michael Sheen, with a whole creation story myth in that they have a fallen angel, ultimately Azazel, who is spoken of in the Bible and the Quran, where we get the word scapegoat from in the Bible. He, being fallen in the end, he created the universe. And because I don't have to speak much of this because it's well understood now through Jacob's Ladder that the God doesn't actually do anything other than we don't know who God is, except for we know that Jesus is God and that he has seen the Father, and he alone, if as far as I'm aware, he alone has only seen the Father. And of course he says he is basically the Father in human form. So there is a throne room, there are archangels, there is a place, heaven, a ninth heaven, and all these angels. And then I read the Book of Mormon, and I read about what Mormons say in the Book of Abraham, and how the Mormons believe, through the Book of Abraham, I believe, that there is in fact a place where God lives, the Father, and that this is actually just a world very far away, and I think it's something to do with Kol, and Kol is in Judaism as a word for God. Ultimately, if Doctor Who is Vishnu has 10 incarnations within Hinduism, ending one of them being Krishna, who is Loki Hermes, and the end being Kalki. It can be said that if these angels are to be higher than man eventually, if man is to be higher than the angels, and God is obviously at the top of this hierarchy, and we get to Revelation and we have the kingdom, and we know that according to the Jews it's Ben David who is in this kingdom, ruling for 1,000 years, which is a Sabbath. But we also know that 7 is connected to perfection, and King David being the 7th brother of 8 brothers, I believe. He is definitely connected to 7. Now we know that even though, according to this theory, that Adam was created by Kronos, and that there was a fall, it is in fact ultimately God the Father speaking through everything, including Kronos, and that he ultimately allowed everything to be realigned, and that there were pagan fallen god foreshadows everywhere, including the Ark and Mount Sinai, and even specific dates and periods and Noah's flood. But what we have is ultimately, like I say, perfect symmetry. And another theory, which I have added to, but haven't really heard Jewish writers or Christian writers write about, it's specifically what I've seen on YouTube, which is that all humans were, in a previous life, one of these fallen angels, the pagan gods, of which there were myriad. So we know that 1/3 fell. We know that as they lowered through, they fell, came through consciousness down from the 9th to the 3rd, that their consciousness was lowered, and so they became more and more carnal, and that it's never truly said of God, do this, do that, do this, do that. It is the angels, of which it's likened to House, the Doctor in House, played by Hugh Laurie, in that he is a doctor, he figures things out, and then he tells his junior doctors and consultants to get on with the job. And amongst themselves, they operate on man and cure and do everything. But it's down to his authority. And say this is alluded to in Jacob's Ladder, in that there is just a hierarchy of angels. Now, the Mormons believe that after the kingdom, and of which is on earth, the kingdom is on earth, 1,000 years, and then there's another battle, and then eventually that's at the point where we have the new heaven and earth, and we have the supernatural city mentioned in Revelation. But Abraham is to have every one of his seed propagate the universe. That is clearly said in the Bible, which means our abode is not just on earth after Zion is created, comes down. Therefore, we will, just like Star Trek, travel the universe. And this hierarchy of angels, of which Sumerians and others and people have on other alternative media have just simply said aliens, of which there is so much evidence. That's one of the reasons why the whole world is waking up in Egypt and around the world, is that they are in fact God's children, and that these angels represent planetary systems and organizations and federations all over the universe, and that many of them are in fact more advanced than us. They are basically gods, and that a select few were given authority over the earth. They became fallen, and then it is God's job ultimately to right that wrong. And the Book of Enoch and others say there was literally 6,000 years from Adam, of which obviously is not the creation of humans on this earth, Neanderthals and Homo erectus, and is not old enough to be the earth. It wasn't the beginning. Adam was created only 6,000 years ago, of which the time period ends 2031, according to many scholars, because Jesus died in 31 AD. There was a literal earthquake on that year, and it adds up exactly to that, according to my knowledge. And the Book of Mormon, if those aren't aware, does speak of a paradigm in itself of America. And for those who don't understand Mormonism, it is Christianity. It's just that Jesus went to India, Thomas was there, and Jesus was seen in America. It makes sense if the Messer and Great Britain are America and Great Britain are to be the protectors of Israel in the last days, then obviously America is very, very important. So the circle, how does one get from Vishnu to Jesus? And how does that relate to King David in the end? The Bible states that David had the keys to the temple, of which was symbolic of heaven. So we know that Jesus said he was a son of David. The Christians have interpreted that to mean that he is Ben David, as in the Jews got this wrong, and it is in fact Jesus all along who will fulfill all the prophecies, and that ultimately he will rebuild the temple and protect the Jews and bring back the 10 lost tribes, and that is in fact Jesus, and that the Jews have simply got this wrong. And he will fulfill these things in his second coming. But if he comes back only in 2031, and he's clearly not here right now, even though obviously he's alive and he's with us, but he's not here literally, it's not his second coming, then there is obviously a panic in the world, because the Jews are trying to look for this Messiah, and the Christians are simply saying, wait, because when you find Antichrist soon, I predict as close as 2025, maybe even the latter part, could even be on a Friday the 13th. That's how symmetrical and synchronous these dates are, according to Jonathan Cahn and Jews in itself. For those who are secular, one can simply see that Apophis, I don't want to scare people, right, but you can just look into Apophis, an asteroid, and that's something for another video, which is mentioned in the Bible as wormwood. Now, if the series of events all add up, and that the Jews and the Christians have missed out things, the Hindus are mentioned within the Bible. They call it hoodoo, and Gerald Flurry does stay, and it's not a good source, but it is on Wikipedia, and there is evidence that Indians were there at Pentecost even. And Plato himself said, obviously we don't know if he literally said it, but there's evidence that he said that he knew of Jews, as it would be, from India. I don't need to say too much about that, because a lot of it is obviously conjecture, but we do have stories of in India of Abraham having, I think it's his father or his grandfather, and there was a flood, a river, and it dried up, and that river is an historical river according to Indian reports in India. It did happen, it's no longer there, and that ultimately Abraham, the father of the Jews, of which obviously we get the name Jews from Judah, but Abraham is the first major part of the Jewish story, being the greatest prophet. He is linked to that country, of which would make sense with all major languages in Europe coming from Sanskrit, being Indo-European, and similarly Sanskrit worked its way into the Middle East and ultimately into the Hebrew language. And there are reports of even pharaohs being from India. So when all is said and done, one can simply look at 2001: Space Odyssey. What a marvel and masterpiece everyone says it is. With it being an obvious allegory and explained by the writer and director that there is a monolith coming from Jupiter, Jupiter being Zeus, and he being the ruler of this world indicated in the Bible with his seat thrown at Pergamum. So he is the ruler of this world, although he is not his father, Kronos, and he overthrew him. And the basis of a continuous line of time is not real. We know that it's not linear. There isn't the past and then we get to the future. We know through science it is more or less like a Mobius loop, and that according, obviously, that's what we believe, and this is alluded to in myriad films because of that. And 2001: Space Odyssey is about man. It starts with apes, lower men. It doesn't have humanoids, but it's apes standing on 2 feet. So they're obviously not the apes as we know today, who do stand on 2 feet, but only do that to bang their chests and what have you. And they eventually evolve. Now, then we have David Bowman, who is a clear indicated person from the Bible with the Messiah in Judaism, Ben David, being a arrow. It's said in Ezekiel he is hidden in God's quiver, which is an arrow sack. And he is being sharpened, perfected, and he is in fact, read it through Isaiah, please, read through Isaiah, and he is imperfect, like I say in the last film, in a comedy way, like Edmund Blackadder. And please listen to the rest of the story. He cannot be Jesus in that way, obviously being a perfect creation, man, never sinned. In the suffering servant, we obviously have a simile between what the Jews say and what Christians say, a parallel. So King David is like Jesus. We know that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. We know David was born in Bethlehem. We know that David was God's beloved, which means simply, basically, God's favourite. We know that it says in the New Testament, Peter has the keys to the gates of heaven. But the key of David is clear, according to Gerard Flurry, that the temple in a sanctuary being heaven, that David has the keys to the kingdom, the millennial kingdom, and he ruling with Jesus. But he is the standard, a flag bearer, a bit like King Charles, in that he has a certain amount of authority, but he is not the government. It's Jesus who runs it. It is his kingdom ultimately, but David is the royal king. And there's a lot of history here, which one can look into, obviously, with the missing pieces. I'll do that for another video of how, well, the Jews say that, some Jews say God broke a covenant, of which Christians would say is impossible, which is that David's throne ended after the kingdom of Judah and Assyria were no more, and that David's throne was said to last forever. There would always be someone of his ancestry on the throne. Christians say that obviously Jesus is taken up to the throne, therefore he is on David's throne. But from David and Solomon and other descendants of David, there was a broken line. But throughout the British Isles, we have history and we have myth of the stone of Scone, Abraham's pillow, where he had the vision of the angels and the Jacob's ladder. We know that there is a stone that England has now, which Queen Elizabeth was coronated on. I didn't see the coronation for King Charles, but he was likely to have had that coronation with that stone, and that versely was taken in the myths and alluded to in the Bible, that Jeremiah the prophet took a descendant of David, his daughter Tamar, to Ireland. And if you go online, you can see that there is in fact said to be a tomb of Jeremiah, and that she was known as Tia Tafe, and she was the first queen of Ireland. And there are many, many stories and legends and poems and films about this and how it relates to. And then it was taken to Scotland, and there's evidence that Braveheart, within the real accuracy of the story, not just the film Braveheart, Mel Gibson, that he wanted this stone back from the English, and that this is why through her, that ultimately Titafi, that we have, I believe it is through her, that we actually have a genealogy from her, of which we get up to, which is very, very real in history, Queen Victoria, who said, even in the Sun newspaper, believe it or not, going back obviously a long time ago, that she was a descendant of David. And that obviously we get to then Queen Elizabeth and then King Charles, Queen Elizabeth II. And then there is evidence throughout the entire countries of Europe that these royal families, of which obviously the House of Windsor is related to, that they are partly Jewish. So there's stories, but there's evidence, historical evidence. There's even buildings where, obviously in every country, where they have the records of the genealogy of man, where they have just real evidence. I've got to finish this part because obviously it relates to why is Ephraim, Great Britain and Manasseh looking after or taking care of Israel, the country now Israel, in God's right hand. And it's because the British and the Americans have always known this. They've known the history of their people. And for those who are doubting that Manasseh is in fact USA, one can only look at the tribes, of which there were a few, make up Manasseh, stated in the Bible, of which one was Naphtali, which was Sweden. And for those who don't understand, Sweden was there at the creation of America. And Dan, being Ireland, there are many, obviously, Irish immigrants in America. And obviously Ephraim. There are obviously the majority of people in America are related to the English. But it became a separate tribe of what we call Manasseh. And Ephraim is not one ethnicity. Obviously, it is a tribe of many different diverse people, but collectively known as Ephraim. And Gerard Flurry states that Ephraim is not just England, Scotland, and Wales. It does in fact include Australia, South Africa, and I don't know if it's in Canada, but I don't know, I don't believe it is, but definitely Australia and South Africa. And so therefore we have the clear indication of this parallel between David and Jesus, and that David would be a relation of King David, and he would be born through Ephraim, Great Britain. The Jews in Israel are looking for Ben David all over the world, but their rabbis think he will come from probably America, with it being a high percentage of Jews in America. The story of Genesis indicates with Joseph of Egypt that Ben Joseph would be from Manasseh, America, and Ben David would be from Ephraim, Great Britain. And that goes back to 2001: Space Odyssey, David Bowman, in that he ultimately, with just like in the Matrix, defeats this AI, which is more or less here now, and that he goes on to become a god. And that's where we get the 2000 Space Odyssey music, and you see him like a baby and a fetus, and he is in the music, and he is basically a god. But at the end sequence, he meets himself, a future self, and that continues in the sequel, and it leads back to Doctor Who, in that how do you get, if I am a Christian, which I am, from Vishnu, of which obviously I've looked into being part Indian, why is he the supreme being in their stories? And Brahma is obviously like Kronos, and the Gnostics say it, and Jesus alludes to Essenes and Gnostics. How do you get that? How do you do that? Well, if time is not linear, and it is loop, and Kronos is a Time Lord, basically, and he has a power of time, of which anyone who knows physics will assume sometime in the future we will have the power of time travel. And time travel, I don't need to explain, is in fact a reality. There are satellites in orbit now. They're in a different time to those that are on the Earth. That their clock does not match up with ours. It's a very simple illustration of the fact that time is relative to gravity, and that ancient people and even the Germans and the Nazis knew this, and that if one wants to get some sort of time disturbance, one merely has to break the weak and the strong bonds of gravity. Excuse me. And that this is not a new theory. And ancient Hindus have spoken through their mass epics of time travel, and how in the age of ignorance now, which is what we are in, that we will not have what they had, and that they almost mock us basically and say that our spaceships are better, our computers are like all this sort of things, and so we know, if you're simply a believer in the ancient alien theory, that these ancient aliens had technology that we didn't have. And then we either forgot all this technology. Obviously, there was a real flood, and much of this evidence has gone. And that things that do turn up just baffle us. But I don't want to speculate too much, but even in Austria just a couple of weeks ago, there's reports saying that it might be a scam, it might be real, but it's evidence of an artifact that looks like a mobile phone. It literally looks like a Nokia mobile phone. I don't want to speculate too much on that, because there is just real things that are real from ancient Egypt and all around the world that do lay down the framework of that obvious theory of ancient aliens, or what the Bible and Jews would say are angels. It merely means messenger at the end of the day, in which there are myriad different types of angels mentioned within the Bible. They didn't look like we see in films with wings, 2 wings. They had very strange faces, as we've seen within the Bible. So the ultimate truth that I get to with what many in the secular world and those who are pagan stating, being that Gaia, Mother Earth, where we get Earth from, is alluded to as being the Holy Spirit, and that God exists in a Trinity according to the Christians, which is more than alluded to in the Bible. God, Jesus, a spirit existing in a Trinity, likened to, as I've read, like water, being existing in 3 different states, like frozen ice and steam and liquid water, different states but the same God. But it makes sense in perfect symmetry that Gaia, a fallen angel, personification of the earth, would be redeemed, made holy, is actually Jesus' spirit. God in the Bible talks about the Holy Spirit as being a woman many different times, with it birthing something, and with everything being a foreshadow, it makes sense that God would realign Gaia to be his spirit, as it were, over everything. So that the hidden sciences and films allude to the fact that Brahma is Kronos, is Loki's father, and that through Picard and other films, which there are many like Quantum Leap, where Sam says, "It's you, the barman, who's leaping me. You're God, aren't you?" And the barman, who is Kronos, in my view, says, "No, I created the bar. You created everything else, more or less." So that leads back to The Shining with Stanley Kubrick, where the devil basically is the barman, and that Jack is Hermes, Loki. He even says it within the films. Many incidences there are. Jack being Jack Flash, Jack of all trades, Union Jack, Hermes. Jack Nicholson has played Loki before Hermes in The Joker in Batman. These actors throughout Hollywood are aware of what they're doing. Some of them are not, but many are aware that they're playing the same sorts of parts throughout their career even, or just reprise them every now and again. Which leads to Bruce Almighty, where Jim Carrey, who has played Loki before in The Mask, takes on the role of God himself, in that God allows him, Morgan Freeman's character, to be God, to be like God. And that he is imperfect to begin with, like David Bowman. And it isn't forever, as it were. God will come back, but he's allowing Jim Carrey's character Bruce to be like God. Well, Michael's name, the Archangel Michael's name, is who is like God. That's his name. All names have a meaning in Judaism. So that leads to the obvious connection, although is very, 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 very hard to say. Excuse me, which is that ultimately David Bowman, or Ben David, ultimately through eons and eons and eons and eons after Millennial Kingdom and so on, and throughout the universe, of which there are planetary systems and angels, that his seed, his children, have to go on and on and on. Throughout the universe, there'll always be one of his children on the throne. Well, that's almost like Jacob's ladder. If there are angels that come down from heaven, and David's on the throne, more or less, forever, then this story of Bruce Almighty, of which is a Jewish story, because and it links up with the moon as well, with Jim Carrey more or less lassoing the moon, and we see this in myriad films and TVs. So there's a link between Jim Carrey and the moon, and therefore Adam and King David. One has to only go one step further and say, well, ultimately, Ben David, or a seed, goes on to be God himself. Now, if God ultimately is Ben David, he will, in fact, end up in his timeline, in our timeline, creating a cherub, Lucifer, and through him, 1/3 will fall, and then man will be created. And because of time travel and the way that would work, is that if he was God, he would have to create Lucifer, cherub, in the first place. If he didn't, he wouldn't even exist to be Adam, and then David, and then Ben David. And man would never have existed. Ultimately, that leads to the thought that the Jehovah's Witnesses are in fact correct, and Jesus was Michael. Michael was Adam. And that, as strange and horrible as that may sound to Christians and Jews who are not aware of that, especially Christians, that is perfect symmetry. Because in the very, very distant future, of which God says basically never happens, right? He says to me that that's basically the amount of time of which the Hindus say that the universe will collapse and basically be no more is around about 500 billion years. Even Professor Brian Cox says there will be an end to this universe. And that CERN and other very, very high ranking scientists in the world have aligned themselves to the Hindu gods, especially Shiva. There is a statue of Shiva outside the headquarters of CERN. CERN being very, very prophetic in that it is linked by many to be trying to open up a new dimension to let these pagan gods, of which are angels, back into this dimension. Now, if they are, of which many would say, the most intelligent people on the earth, of which they created the internet through Tim Berners-Lee, they are incredible scientists. And they're believing in Shiva by the looks of it, who is in union with Brahma and Vishnu. Now, we know that Vishnu had basically malevolent and benevolent incarnations of himself, of which Loki being a more or less malevolent fallen being, and he being the prodigal son, according to what I'm saying, my theory, and he being redeemed through God to be either a foreshadow of Ben David, and he being, even on to many people, I've even seen this on YouTube when they speak of David Bowman being a type of devil. So it could be argued that ultimately Vishnu was never really, he's not alone now. So he's the preserver of all the multiverse, and that we see in Disney's Loki that he is the sacrificer at the end, and that he usurps Kang, who is a type of Zeus's throne. He literally sits on the throne of Zeus and who is a bit like Kronos could be, but I'm unsure whether Kang is Kronos or Zeus. But he usurps that throne. He sits on that throne, with this being a a parallel between Zeus or Thor being the ruler of this world as given to him by Kronos, and that Loki had it a part inheritance. Kronos just said, which of my two sons shall be the ruler of Midgard, whether it be Loki or Thor. It makes sense that then Ben-David would be like the realignment of that, and he would be the king of Midgard. In Isaiah, it is alluded to and just spoken of that Ben-David is the Prince of Peace. We know the Prince of Peace is a reference to Michael, according to many scholars, and that he is in fact within Isaiah called God. We know that God speaks of his name being I am that I am, or I will be who I will be, a reference, as I say, to Doctor Who, and that there is somebody other than Vishnu orchestrating things that he himself is not aware of, being the ultimate power of all, of which lives in a union, I believe, with Gaia, Mother Earth, the Spirit. So this is a perfect circle, of which we get to this cherub, ultimately, the which we call Lucifer, being who I would say is Vishnu. He is, of course, a perfect being, and that the Hindus say this being is supreme, which might as well be perfect. The stone itself, you see, I'm sure there must be a story about this stone, because I watched a video just the other day where Stephen Hawking himself speaks of a stone in an interview he gave, and reality. So we know that this reality, according to David Bowie and other theorists, David Icke and others, is a bad copy of the original reality, and that God is unknowable only to Jesus, and that even within Quantum Leap, Sam is in fact leaping himself through time. And then the Barman Kronos gives an allegory of how he even says at the end, like when he said out his piece, you can watch it, he says, God bless, God bless. So we have many incidents of this throughout film and cinema where the character of Ben-David, they always say like God bless, God you. Could it be that in the future Ben-David becomes the God that we know of, the Father, and that he ultimately comes down to be Jesus and dies for all our sins, and that the time it takes, that God tells me, which is like for this universe to end almost, is like walking from here the Jupiter, and the time taken for Ben David to get to be the God the Father would be like walking from one side of the universe to the other, which basically is impossible. And God says you can always say never happens. It's that far in the future that it basically never happens. That is something that would ultimately in our human brains create an omnipotent, omnipresent, and omnipotent being, all knowing, all seeing, all powerful. And that would explain why God knows us all intimately. And that Jesus, who is always referencing Loki and throughout the Bible, if it takes that long to be God, and then eons and eons more, and then the fall, and then he ultimately has to do all of that to be Jesus himself, to die for our sins. The barman in Quantum Leap says, ask Sam, what do you want to do? And he says, I want to go home. And the barman says that you got to do this before a great journey, something great happens, a difficult journey. That's a powerful thought. Could it just be a story? Could it? Why does this story seem to be in myriad films and TVs and songs? And why would perfect symmetry explain of what I believe is everything? Not my theory. I've just applied it to the 7 major religions and TV and song and cinema, and I understand the hidden, the occult. And to the point where Jesus would know us all if he was Adam in the previous, so long ago that it's unreal. After all, Adam and Eve were created in God's image. Not many people understand how that makes sense. The Jews say that that means male and female, that we were created in male and female. But we are, according to Jews and Christians, a copy of God. We are on earth. And that the union of a man and woman is God itself, basically. And that ultimately is love. And that even secular philosophers would argue that God is an idea, a thought, and that the universe does seem to power around thoughts, and that thoughts become real in this universe. Which leads back to the story at the beginning, which is an idea from Vishnu was conscious itself, became conscious itself, and that this force is stronger than Vishnu. He was not even aware that this consciousness was far greater than he. But it ultimately coming from his mind, as it were. You know, and I'll just keep posting videos, of which I'm going to do some editing of some real film footage of films that talk about this and time travel, like Back to the Future, and other videos of how ultimately, on a human level, because obviously all of this is new to me even, and that no one's going to really understand or believe what I'm saying without really looking into it, but on a personal level, one can see this story on a personal level in Soul by Disney, where we have a man and he is a faux deaf and he goes to a holding place, and then he hasn't got his body, but then he has to learn to be something, to have a soul. And then there's a character called 22. 22 is definitely a reference to Ben David, with his number being 22. 222. That is definitely a link to Ben David. And then this is a metaphor and a story of how God redeems many of the fallen angels. So some of them, like Zeus and obviously Kronos and myriad others who fell and fornicated women and obviously are creating the evil that we have in the world, they will be, as Christians know, locked in the bottomless pit, and that they are and in the burning lake of sulfur, and that they will, and that is a story of in our view of the center of the earth, and they are immortal, but they will be chained up forever. Some Christians think that's just the end, but I don't think it is. In the but that is their resting place, and then the devil can never harm us again. Excuse me. So where do these other angels exist? And the simple explanation is that Earth itself is redemption, not only for man, but ultimately those angels who fell. And that all of us, not just Ben David being a foreshadow of Loki, but that we are all those angels, and that only a few of them, the mighty ones that we know, are here to what we know, such as Loki as in Ben David, and Gecko, and even the god Mars, and obviously Apollo being the Antichrist, who will not be redeemed. But the theory is that God loves his children so much, he's given us this earth to help us get back to heaven. And that reincarnation is in fact a way of purifying ourselves, to regain love, to understand, and the Bible is a right way of thinking about God. And that some go higher and some always fall. And that Jesus ended this cycle of birth and rebirth for good through him, if we believe in him and do good works. And that there were, as we know, millions, billions, billions of these angels. There are 9 billion people, more or less, on this earth. If Apollo can reincarnate as a human, why can't those other angels reincarnate as humans now. And wouldn't that be a perfect thing? Secularists always say, oh, God, he just wants to send us to hell or send us to heaven. There's no in between. Like, what about all the people that don't believe in Jesus? They just follow their own way. They are on the left, say, who are goats, who are Satanists, who don't necessarily believe in evil, just believe in these fallen angels weren't, like Loki, weren't all bad, like Kronos. He was evil, but what is evil? Was he actually just a father, just like in the story, prodigal son? And he did, in fact, love Loki, and he's saying goodbye. He's going to die. He will be locked away, and he's saying goodbye. And this is a message throughout all these movies, like in The Sixth Sense and Picard. He's saying goodbye. I love you. And you never knew how much I loved you, as it were. But the people of this earth are not aware of even these pagan gods being real, especially in the Christian world. With Jonathan Cahn waking up America to these pagan gods and the returning, with Dr. Thomas Horn indicating that Apollo is the Antichrist, who is in human form now, will die, and then be reborn as with his powers. What is to say that this is a beautiful love story? That these angels in the past and now can travel through time, but the cycle was ended when Jesus died on the cross. It was defeated. Death was only defeated then. The devil and all his angels only defeated then. And this happened in the past, but for Ben David, this is the future. This is ultimate future. David Bowman in 2000 Space Odyssey. So we all have to look into this. And my videos aren't getting that many views at the moment. There are some. Obviously, like I say, I haven't put in film footage and I haven't put in the Bible verses. And even I like to see the Bible verses and see, because no one likes to actually go on the internet and see these Bible verses for themselves. They just like it on the video, right? But Disney keeps alluding to these films, this narrative over and over again. It is largely a pagan company. It is a pagan company. And Walt Disney was a pagan, and you name a film that isn't about this in some way. I mean, Beauty and the Beast, that's Loki, Hermes, and Belle. I think it might actually be, if it's not Eve, then it's Echo. You've got, obviously, the Jungle Book. There's references to that in India, and all over the place. There are all sorts of references to this story in the Jungle Book, and the Jungle Book 2. The Lion King, definitely about the Messiah Ben David, having a father who has the voice of Darth Vader, James Earl Jones. There we have, another reference to all these actors playing some of what. You even have them Blackadder. So being read. Then you have Rowan Atkinson is a voice in The Lion King. This is now a reference to South Africa in The Lion King. But still a story of Bassab and David being part of Ephraim. Through this beautiful narrative of these movies, and everyone loves Disney in some way. We have Peter Pan, and then we have other stories of Tinkerbell and Pixie Hollow. Peter Pan, Loki never grew up. Loki never grew up. And obviously, we know at the end of the story, he does grow up. He does redeem himself. He does love Wendy. He does become a man. And the events of the world will unfold like this, I believe, very soon. Don't wait until the tribulation period starts to try and figure these things out, because there are many films and indicators that sticking to love. I want to stick to love, but the videos are important. We do have this time period that will come to an end where knowledge will be limited, and that maybe even Bibles themselves online won't be available. I would definitely get a King James Bible. I would definitely a physical copy and a Nag Hammadi book. Because just what if? Just what if? Just what if it's real? Just what if it's real? You can't watch any TV show, any movie, even read a poem without any of these things being mentioned at the moment. And I've watched hundreds and hundreds of movies. I've listened to hundreds and hundreds of songs. And they're talking about Pan, Echo, Ben David, Jesus, Adam, Eve. And just one big circle of life that is in itself